Kate Trump specifically with some young girls. I'm not going to share any specifics because it's too graphic to share here. It's readily available on Twitter for folks who are interested in doing a deeper dive into this stuff. But suffice it to say that the stories that were put forward and submitted to law enforcement on behalf of these young girls are as gruesome and vile as it gets, which raises the question about Pam Bondi's involvement in all of this, because just a few days ago, just a week ago, Pam Bondi testified in front of the Oversight Committee, and she said this.
There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that. This has been the most transparent presidency.
So that was Pam Bondi saying, and I quote,
You need something,
"There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime." But doesn't that negate the fact that there is evidence contained within the Epstein files, credibility notwithstanding, because I don't know whether they've gone into the credibility of that evidence, but there does exist evidence that Donald Trump has done something wrong or committed a crime. And so can you speak to that statement that was put forward by Pam Bondi in light of this new evidence that's surfacing right now from the Epstein files?
Yeah, Brian, a couple of things are at play.
I'll bring it by.
First of all, if a witness or an alleged victim orally communicates to the FBI or any law enforcement agency, I was assaulted, that's evidence of a potential crime. Now, it has to be investigated. It has to be either corroborated or contradicted, or if neither of those two things can be accomplished by law enforcement, it may just sit in FBI or law enforcement files, sort of pending further investigative leads that can be pursued. But the reality is, if you're reading that in a police file, it's evidence. It may not be credible evidence at the end of the day. It may be credible evidence at the end of the day, but it is clearly evidence contained in the file. So I have to tell you, Brian, when I saw the Attorney General of the United States, Pam Bondi, say there is no evidence that Donald Trump committed any crime, and then we started to see reports from people who are doing deep dives into the, millions of Epstein documents, and things began to emerge that seemed to implicate or at least reference some of the things Donald Trump had done. I agree with a number of lawmakers that I have heard say Pam Bondi lied in her testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. It would have been very different if she had said, for example, there is no credible evidence in the Epstein files that Donald Trump engaged in any criminal activity. You know what? That word would have done some real heavy lifting in protecting her against an allegation that she lied to Congress. Now, she would have to back it up with, for example, we saw the references to Donald Trump's conduct in there. We drilled down, we investigated, we interviewed the witnesses and the victims, and we deemed it to be not credible at the end of the day. Then if she had said, there's no credible evidence in the Epstein files that Donald Trump engaged in any crimes or misconduct, that might be a completely different story. That's not what she said. And that's why I think you are hearing some lawmakers, and I agree with those lawmakers, it appears that Bondi committed the crime of making a false statement to Congress. It's kind of similar to perjury, but when somebody lies to Congress, whether under oath or not, it's what we call a 1001 statement under 18 United States Code, Section 1001. False statements to Congress. Each false statement you make to Congress carries with it up to 5 years in prison. And, based on this old prosecutor's assessment of her testimony and what we are learning, what's emerging from the Epstein files, it seems like, at some point, she's going to have to be investigated once the rule of law comes back into the light of day for the potential crimes she committed before Congress.
Well, it's clear that the DOJ under Pam Bondi is not going to investigate Pam Bondi. I mean, hell, the whole point of this DOJ is that they don't investigate or prosecute anybody aligned with their administration. But I guess the question remains, what is the statute of limitations for something like this? And is it something that a subsequent administration would be able to pick up?
Yeah, a 1001 violation, false statement to Congress, carries a 5-year statute of limitations. So assuming the next presidential election goes to the Democrats, then you're going to have the rule of law becoming a thing again. Importantly, in the Department of Justice itself. And the one thing I have been beating the drum about, Brian, as have you, is, we tried the lack of accountability route last time when Donald Trump left office. And, it feels to me like Merrick Garland sort of de facto was of the belief that, again, we have to just put this long national nightmare behind us with no accountability for any of the crimes of Trump and company. Eventually, when push came to shove, he appointed Jack Smith. Too little, too late, notwithstanding Jack Smith's best efforts. But, we have been fooled before, right? Gerald Ford said we were going to put the long national nightmare behind us by deciding to pardon Richard Nixon and, make sure there was no accountability at all for the crimes that he committed in a very real sense against the American people. I would assert that, in fact, in practice, we tried that again last time Donald Trump left power. And you know what? If we do it a third time, once the Democrats come back into power, if we again decide for whatever reason to decline to hold Trump and company accountable for their crimes, as far as I'm concerned, we don't keep our republic, and frankly, I don't think we deserve to keep our republic. So that's why, I will remain, focused like a laser beam on accountability for the crimes being perpetrated against the American people by Trump and anybody else that an investigation shows committed crimes. They need to be held accountable.
And I'm so glad you said that. And I would use this opportunity then to tell folks who aren't yet subscribed to both of these channels, both my channel and Brian's channel, if you think that our commentary is important and meets the urgency of this moment, the best way to show some support for our work is to subscribe to our channels. It's 100% free, but it's a great way to support us and independent media, so those links are in the post description of this video. If you're not yet subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. Glenn, so we've spoken about the prospect of Pam Bondi having committed the crime of lying to Congress, basically lying on oath. But you and I have also spoken about another crime that she and other officials at the DOJ have possibly committed, and that is to act as an accessory after the fact. So can you speak about that a little bit? Because your theory of this case has actually been validated by a number of state attorneys general that I've spoken with after the fact.
Yeah, if we learned anything going back to the Watergate era, if the crime doesn't get you, the cover-up will, because it really was the cover-up that brought Richard Nixon and his criminal associates down. So now we have the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanchard, and potentially others engaged in what sure looks like a cover-up. We would need to drill down, we would need to investigate, but we know that there are improper redactions being made to the Epstein files in violation of federal law, the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And we know some of the potential wrongdoers, their identity is being hidden from the public in violation of federal law. If that is not accessory after the fact, helping people avoid accountability for their crimes, I don't know what is. To be an accessory after the fact, all it takes is you have to know a crime has been committed in violation of the laws of the United States, and you have to do anything that would actually help the perpetrator avoid detection, apprehension, trial, or punishment. By wrongfully and unlawfully concealing the names of people who seem to have been involved in criminal conduct contained in the Epstein files, it's really no different than Pam Bondi just hiding these people out in their basement to make sure, that they're not detected, that they're not tried, that they're not punished, that they're not held accountable for their crimes. So the elements, the principles of the crime, accessory after the fact, seem to be there in spades. And again, we have to wait for the rule of law to come back into the light of day, because we know Pam Bondi and Todd Blanchard are not going to hold themselves accountable, and they're sure as heck not going to do anything that could, visit Donald Trump in a negative way.
Glenn, do you have faith that our judicial system can handle this? And I ask as somebody who did hundreds of episodes with you during the 2020 to 2024 period, where Trump was being prosecuted in 4 legitimate different cases, was indicted in these cases, and none of them were able to be seen through until the end. And so look, I know that a lot of people watching this right now are gonna say, yeah, sure, they can be held accountable, but what is there to show that we actually have the stomach to hold powerful people to account in this country, given everything that we've seen? And so, what would your response be to that criticism?
Yeah, Brian, it's a fair question, and it's an important question. Do I think the judiciary is up to the task of holding, in particular, the ruling class criminals accountable? My answer is yes. And now half of the viewers have probably said, Glenn, you're full of baloney, because we're not seeing a lot of accountability coming to Donald Trump. But I always have to ask folks to take a step back and remember where we were when Trump won the last presidential election. We were in the process of challenging corrupt Judge Aileen Cannon's dismissal of the classified documents case, challenging it in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And let me tell you, Jack Smith's team would have won that challenge. The case would have been returned to the trial court, probably with the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ordering that it not go back to Judge Cannon, but rather go to a fair, independent, impartial judge, because the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals had previously reversed, I would call it a smackdown, reversed Judge Cannon twice previously for abusing her judicial discretion in favor of Donald Trump. I mean, I still have a hard time absorbing that she was not removed from the classified documents case earlier. But that case was in active litigation. It would have been returned and it would have gone forward because it wouldn't enjoy presidential immunity. These were crimes Donald Trump was indicted for after he left the presidency. No presidential immunity for that. Where were we in the January 6th case? There were 4 felony charges indicted against Donald Trump. True, a compromised Supreme Court rewrote the Constitution and gave him absolute immunity, but only for one category of crimes that he committed as part of his core constitutional functions, like sending the military to kill his political opponents. For some reason, 6 justices of the Supreme Court thought that was a good idea, to give a president, free rein, leeway, a get-out-of-jail-free card for ordering the military to kill his political opponents. Again, I don't know this world that we're living in right now. But there were 2 other categories of presidential crimes. One, crimes that a president commits in his official capacity enjoys a presumption of immunity, but the prosecutors can rebut that presumption. And perhaps most importantly, private acts of a candidate, like a candidate who was aggrieved because he lost an election, so he committed crimes to try to unlawfully retain the power of the presidency. There is no immunity for those crimes. I maintain the J6 crimes for which Donald Trump was indicted fall into that 3rd category. Where were we in that case? We were in front of Judge Tanya Chutkan litigating the precise issues that I just laid out in these 3 categories of crimes. And that case would have proceeded to trial. Wouldn't have been quick, wouldn't have been easy. We were in the process, the judiciary, but for the 6 compromised Supreme Court justices, the judiciary writ large was in the process of holding Donald Trump accountable. And it was only because he got elected president and DOJ has deigned that you can't prosecute a sitting criminal president, but you can once he leaves office. We're not done by a long shot, and the judiciary was holding strong with a few notable exceptions, Aileen Cannon and some of the Supreme Court justices. I still believe to my core, Brian, I was in the business of a federal prosecutor for 30 years. I still believe to my core the federal judiciary is up to the task, and if given the opportunity, and the way it will be given the opportunity is if, Donald Trump falls from power, hopefully, even before the end of his 4-year term at the rate he's going. I don't wish him any harm, and I'm always, talking about how we have to fight peacefully to make sure he gets dethroned at the earliest possible moment. But once he falls from power, we should be back in the business of holding Donald Trump accountable for his crimes. So in the most long-winded answer I've ever given you, yes, I have faith and confidence that the judiciary remains up to the task.
The difficult part for me to process is we are told that the American judicial system is like the gold standard, right? And then we see this kind of stuff happen at the hands of Donald Trump. We see the judiciary unable to see his prosecution through to the end. And then just like that, we see Brazil prosecute and imprison, their criminal leaders. We see it in South Korea, like these other countries who don't beat their chests as these behemoths of law and order, these beacons of virtue and integrity. Like they're just regular other countries around the world that are able to do what somehow eludes us in this shining city on a hill in America.
Brian, I don't even think I would call the U.S. of A. one of the regular old countries. I think we have fallen beneath the expectation of a civilized country, and we should look to and learn from the other countries that have decided, apparently, I think we can throw France into that category as well, decided that they are determined to hold folk accountable, even if those people are rich, powerful, influential, connected. Other countries have decided, no, the rule of law will apply to those folk as well. And they go about using the same system they use against everybody else, and they hold them accountable. We are falling so far beneath that sort of, basic sort of responsibility of a civilized nation that, we are going to need to kind of dig ourselves out of this hole and restore, the public's faith in our ability to treat everybody equally under the law.
Look, I'm grateful for your voice and hopefully getting us back to that point at some juncture in the future. So for those who are watching, again, if you'd like to support our work, elevate our voices, the best way to do that is to subscribe. I'm going to put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen. So if you're not yet subscribed, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Completely free to do so, but again, a great way to support us and independent media. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown. This is Democracy Watch. Mark, with everybody focusing their attention on Epstein, there is one person who is alive right now who really does have all of the answers, and that's Ghislaine Maxwell, who's right now under the custody of the Bureau of Prisons. She's in federal prison right now, serving out a 20-year prison term. And so what is the DOJ able to do as far as she's concerned in terms of I don't want to say interfering in this case, but how could she be helpful to the DOJ? Or how could the DOJ, conversely, be helpful for her if they have a vested interest in keeping her quiet?
Right. So, her status has very recently become a central focus for a few reasons. The first is, by sheer coincidence, and it is actually by sheer coincidence, the Department of Justice's response to her petition to the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn her conviction was due earlier this week. And we a lot of us who were otherwise not following these filings followed it very carefully, and the Department of Justice stood by the prosecution and said that her petition should be denied. So where we stand as we are recording this is that the Department of Justice has taken the position that her conviction was correct, it was proper, there was nothing wrong with it, and that conviction should stand. Obviously, I start with that because the most obvious thing that we have seen Donald Trump do is he has abused the pardon power, right? So Donald Trump could grant a pardon, and the Supreme Court has largely said that the pardon power is absolute. So, it would be extremely untoward. It would be, problematic politically and from a variety of perspectives. But there is nothing that prevents Donald Trump from having word delivered to her that if she says or doesn't say certain things, he will deliver a pardon. He is immune from prosecution for bribery or anything like that. And like I said, the pardon power has really been held to be absolute. And so that is something that we, of course, would be watching very carefully about. But that's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, that would, let's call that the carrot. Okay. At the other end of the spectrum, the stick is that she is an inmate, And she is within the care, custody, and control of the Bureau of Prisons, which is within the Department of Justice. And they get to decide where she serves her sentence. We oftentimes hear judges, say that someone should serve their sentence in a minimum security or a camp or in some place close to their home or, in the north or in the south or where there are facilities for health or whatever, right? We oftentimes hear that. What people don't realize is those are just recommendations. Judges don't decide where someone serves their sentence. They don't decide whether they're in minimum security or maximum security. They don't decide whether they get certain privileges or don't get certain privileges. All of that is decided by the Bureau of Prisons. And so they oftentimes make these recommendations, judges make these recommendations, but, and the Bureau of Prisons has reasons to, listen to those recommendations, but they're not binding in any way, shape, or form. So, if the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Prisons decided, we are moving you to a less favorable facility, that is something the Department of Justice can do. If they want to move if they want to move a prisoner out of one circuit or district into another, that is something they can do. And by the way, we have seen the Trump Justice Department play a little bit of those games with not necessarily the Bureau of Prisons, but with ICE, where they say, we want to move someone out of the New York City area or the Second Circuit into the Fifth Circuit, Louisiana. And some of that is like just making conditions harsher, but some of it is also making the judicial system, making it less favorable to a prisoner who complains about that, right? So they pretty much control access to the conditions she lives in. The final thing I'd say is that at any time, either the Department of Justice or the Republicans in Congress, either one of them, could grant her immunity from future prosecution. This wouldn't get her out of prison. It's not a pardon. It doesn't get her out for what's now. But they could say, we want you to answer these questions. And if you refuse to answer questions, we will immunize you for the purpose of those answers, which means we cannot prosecute.
I'm on the clock. What you want? Some wheels?
That we learn from that. Now, we can prosecute if you lie, right? So we prosecute for perjury, but we cannot further prosecute you
I'll bring it to you.
For sex trafficking, conspiracy, for anything we learn. And that is a tool that is available to the Department of Justice or Republicans in Congress if, in fact, they wanted the truth from her, right? It wouldn't give her any benefit. It wouldn't give her any protection. It wouldn't get her out of prison any sooner. But they could compel her testimony. And so I find it interesting that the Republicans in Congress, who seem to want to haul before them every person who may have ever walked into the White House and seen an auto pen machine, that they don't seem so interested in hearing from her.
Is it possible that the Bureau of Prisons, again, under the direction of the DOJ, could prevent anybody from talking to Ghislaine Maxwell if they wanted to?
Well, so again, anyone is a very broad term. They can restrict her visitation. They can restrict, whether she gets more time. They could, whether she's in solitary, whether she has restricted visitation rights, whether she's able to use the commissary, whether she's able to make phone calls, whether she's able to give interviews, right? Like, those are all within the
You're through to your garage. You need me to bring you a ride?
The Bureau of Prisons control, because they control the facilities. Now, there are a couple of exceptions then. Obviously, if the Department of Justice wanted to meet with her, or the FBI wanted to meet with her, they would be able to meet with her, right? Because they're within that structure. And they would not be able to limit her access to her own lawyers, right? Because she has an ongoing case. As I mentioned, this petition in the Supreme Court. So at least with respect to that, and probably with respect to any other legal question she has, they would have to let her see her lawyers. Whether they would need to abide by an effort by members of Congress to visit her, again, we have the norms of the past, and then we have the law, and honestly, Congress has a right in the immigration detention system to visit people, and the Department of Justice is currently violating those laws. So I think it is fair to say that Pam Bondi
you calling for some wheels? I'm Johnny on the spot. I'll hook you up.
Prisons could prevent anyone
It's coming at you.
Justice, even if that's not the custom, the norm, the expectation, or even in some instances the law.
I guess the question I'm trying to drill down on then, maybe the more appropriate question, is there a way for the Justice Department, if they have a vested interest in keeping her quiet? And I ask this because clearly Donald Trump is not is not overtly willing to release these files. And so using that same information, if they have a vested interest in keeping Maxwell quiet, is there a way that the DOJ could gag her and prevent her from kind of offering up any information that, very much like the files themselves, may incriminate, I don't know, Donald Trump, somebody in this administration? There's got to be some reason that he doesn't want these things to get out.
Yeah, so it's not that they can gag her in the sense that, like, you get a court order and prevent someone from speaking. But they control every aspect of her life. Okay, literally from the moment she wakes up to the moment she goes to sleep. What she can eat, whether she can watch TV, whether she is in a cell or in an open camp, whether she gets, how much time she gets outside of the yard. So I don't think people appreciate just how controlled prisoners in our prisons and jails are. And so there are any number of levers that the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice have to make it very clear to any prisoner that they are doing something that is pleasing and something that is displeasing. I mean, that's before we get to, like, whether, for example, she has a job, whether she has to sit in her cell, whether she gets good time credit, right? Whether, like, there's 1,000 ways in which the Department of Justice, without overt threats, can make it very clear to her that if she wants to spend more time in prison and do harder time, that's one option. And if she wants to have a shorter period of time and do easier, that's another option. And for most prisoners, that's like an easy thing. Like, that's like that's like a decision that's very easy for them to make. Which is the reason why, Brian, I want to raise this again. The Department of Justice or the Republican Congress, and the reason why I say or is Congress has an independent ability to subpoena witnesses that they do not need to rely on the Department of Justice. They have the ability to compel testimony without the Department of Justice. And I have been involved in cases where Congress will issue subpoenas, including to people in federal custody, because they believe they will not get the truth unless this prisoner is in their, is in front of them without the without being in a cell. Yeah. And so I ask, why aren't the Republicans in Congress, who have ran campaigns and spoken out about how we need to have the Epstein files, we need to get to the truth, why aren't they saying we want her to appear in public testimony? Why aren't they voting to release the Epstein files, right? They could, without the Department of Justice's consent, they could pass a law or they could subpoena those records and release them themselves.
Right.
And so it is not just that the Department of Justice can engage in activities to make it clear to a prisoner, don't talk to the media, don't talk to whoever. But what's shocking here is you have Mike Johnson and his caucus that seems all of a sudden very, very quiet on this topic and has actually voted against a resolution to release the Epstein files and is not taking steps, as far as I can tell, to have her, to have her interviewed and deposed. At the same time that I point out that they seem very interested in everyone and anyone who worked in the White House and was familiar with an article.
So I want to finish off with this. We know that the Trump administration is a corrupt administration that's willing to defy the law if they feel they need to. We also know that Trump very much seems like he doesn't want to release these files. And so if we assume in this hypothetical that Donald Trump will act corruptly, is there a world where or is there precedent where you have corrupt prosecutors, corrupt officials who can strike some deal with an inmate in order to release information, and then they can be or not release information, withhold information in exchange for favorable terms? I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell is right now serving a 20-year prison sentence. We wouldn't know if she struck some deal with the DOJ to reduce that sentence or to have some type of pardon agreement, sorted out the day before Trump leaves office. And so is it possible here in that scenario where we have somebody acting corruptly that they could strike some deal so that in the event she does come and testify, she could omit information or just outright lie in exchange for, a shorter term or whatever it may be?
Okay, so first of all, you don't need to get that conspiratorial, okay? the fact is the U.S. government strikes deals with inmates all the time to get testimony that the government thinks is favorable. Now, they'll say, of course, it has to be truthful, but...
Right, well, that's the difference. That's what I'm talking about.
Right, but there are get some criminal defense lawyers on this podcast, and they will tell you that the ability of the Department of Justice and federal prosecutors, or for that matter, state prosecutors, to lean on inmates and pressure them to offer testimony. I mean, let's just talk really quickly about the Obrego Garcia case, where all of a sudden the Department of Justice and DHS in the criminal case against him, seem to be cutting deals and letting out actual human traffickers to offer testimony. So you don't really have to get that fanciful before you'd get a lot of exercised people to say, well, welcome to the criminal justice system.
Right. I'm like, Mark, try to imagine a world in which an official was corrupt.
Right. Okay. So that's number one. But number two, yeah, of course. Look, the fact is, our criminal justice system is set up to reduce the sentences of people who provide cooperation and assistance to law enforcement. That's just how the system is set up. And it's also set up, it's not supposed to be, but it is in reality set up, that for people who don't play ball with the government, their sentences are harder and they're longer.
Yeah.
And so, could there be that deal? Yes. And in fact, I think in a moment of honesty, even good prosecutors would say, not only can there be that deal, the system kind of runs on those deals, not corruptly, but it runs on those deals. So you wouldn't necessarily know. And the final thing I want to say on this is, I was looking at some of the records involving our good friend Emil Bovee, right? This is the guy who's up for a very important judgeship on the Third Circuit. You and I have talked about this, and it would be it's like an outrageous situation. This is Donald Trump's personal lawyer. And so I went back and I looked at Danielle Sassoon, who was a conservative Republican, made the acting U.S. attorney by Donald Trump in his second term. And she winds up resigning because Emil Bovee says basically she needs to agree to let Adams walk. And in her
Adams, the mayor of New York, who the DOJ prosecuted.
In her resignation letter, people should go read this. In her resignation letter, she says that Eric Adams' lawyers came in and offered a quid pro quo, and that Emil Bovee, at the end of it, told her staff who had taken notes to destroy their notes. So, is it possible, Brian? Yes, it's possible. Have you not
the better question is there a world in which this doesn't happen?
Correct. I mean, what world have you been living in for the last few months?
Yeah. Well, we will of course stay on top of this, but I think the broader message here is to kind of proceed through whatever happens next with a healthy dose of skepticism, understanding full well that the administration that is oftentimes in charge of disseminating a lot of this information is not acting in good faith and, in fact, acting for their own protection. And clearly, Donald Trump has shown, and we spoke about this in yesterday's video, Donald Trump has shown that he has every interest in the world in preventing this information and getting out by the way he's acting. And there's a lot of consciousness of guilt happening, and his behavior here tells a lot.
Right, so, and Brian, I want to come back to this point one last time. The reason why Congress will oftentimes do this directly is to alleviate, to some extent, it's still not perfect, but to alleviate to some extent those pressures. Yeah. Because Congress can bring that witness, that inmate, that prisoner, to their offices. And with Democrats and Republicans both present, they can talk to that person without the Department of Justice in the room.
Yeah.
Right? And they have the ability to grant immunity if they feel like they need to do that in order to get this person to testify truthfully. And so it is very, very, you talk about consciousness of guilt, it is very, very interesting that a Congress that has hauled before them university presidents, Democrats, Biden staff who they're still interested in. And remember, these are the same people who hauled Hillary Clinton in front of them for hour upon hour upon hour involving Benghazi. These are not people who are shy to bring people in front of them when they think that is necessary to get to the quote unquote truth. And the fact that that Mike Johnson and Republicans are hiding in the corner tells you again from a different angle that they probably do not want her offering public testimony.
Right. And so for anybody watching here, left, right, or center, if the goal here at the end of this is to get to the truth, not to protect Donald Trump or his interests, but to get to the truth, there is one way to do that. So you can blindly protect Trump, or you can have somebody like Ghislaine Maxwell come in front of the Congress and testify. But clearly, it seems that you can't do both. With that said, I know you've been covering this with an especially important perspective from as a lawyer for the last 3 decades on your YouTube channel. So highly recommend for anybody who's watching right now, if you are not yet subscribed to Democracy Docket, please make sure to subscribe. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.
All right, so there is a battle for the new monetary order between gold and Bitcoin. Right now, it's not really looking good for Bitcoin.
If Bitcoin falls 90% for the next 4 years, we'll refinance the debt.
Refinance where, Michael?
We'll just roll it forward. I mean, again...
But you think banks would lend to you at that point?
Yeah, because...
Okay, so let me explain what's happening. For the past several decades, the world worked with a very specific monetary structure. In order to grow the economy and expand something called the GDP, we had to expand the debt. And in order to expand the debt, we had to grow the money. And as that system got bigger and bigger, most of the world's capital flowed through the US dollar and into financial assets like the US stock market. That's also why stocks have outperformed almost every other investment. And Bitcoin was born into this world during this expansionary period of time. All this endless money printing. And now that system is sort of coming to a breaking point. Because debt isn't just growing, it is now exploded. And it's starting to outgrow the economies that are supposed to support it. And so something called the global old rules-based order is coming to an end.
The international order based on rights and rules no longer exists.
Now, throughout history, when this happens, money looks for something called the safest neutral asset. And what does that mean? A neutral asset is something that's not tied to a specific country or a government. It's outside the system. And historically, those have been assets with a finite supply. And for thousands of years, that was mostly gold. And in the modern era, a lot of people believed that Bitcoin was supposed to be the digital equivalent, right? So the world thought, okay, well, if we don't know what's gonna happen, and we don't know what the new system is gonna look like, then the hardest asset is usually the safest bet. And because Bitcoin is digital and portable and finite, a lot of people also thought it would outperform everything else, including gold. Except that's not what's happening right now. Gold is breaking out to new highs. Central banks are buying physical gold at the fastest pace in decades. And at the same time, Bitcoin has actually lost value relative to gold. So the question is, well, if we're really going into this new multipolar world, and if countries and people are really losing confidence in US treasuries and the dollar and maybe even the stock markets, then why is gold leading right now? Why is it that the asset that was to represent the future monetary standard getting left behind? And if this keeps going, how low is Bitcoin gonna go? Maybe the most important question, is this temporary, or is this the start of what some people call a capital rotation event, which could last for more than a decade? Now, these are all very interesting questions, and I'm gonna try to answer some of them using the latest data and analytics, and hopefully at the end, you'll be able to better understand what's happening in this crazy world. So with that said, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andre Jick. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the gold and for the Bitcoin. So I want to explain what's happening to gold and Bitcoin through the lens of two big forces. This will get extra nerdy, but we're going to use the macro force and something called the technical force. And the easiest way to understand what they are is to compare them and give you an analogy to physics. Now, in physics, you have something called the theory of general relativity, which explains gravity and the curvature of space and time. Basically, it explains the movements of big objects like planets and galaxies. I think of this as sort of like the macro force. It's very slow, and it sort of guides the general direction of things over a long period of time. Well, then you have something called quantum mechanics, which explains the movements of tiny particles and atoms. It's very chaotic, and it doesn't make any sense when you compare it to how the big things move. And when I think of quantum mechanics, I think of how investment markets sometimes work. Like, they're completely unpredictable in the short term, and they don't make any sense at all to me. So the macro is the big picture stuff, like the monetary order, sovereign debt levels, geopolitical changes, right? All those kinds of things that Ray Dalio talks about when he explains economics. Now, on the other side of that, though, is the technical side of the force, which is what people like Benjamin Cowan and North Star charts show us. That's the moving averages, the support levels, the ratio of Bitcoin versus gold, right? That's the particle physics inside the system. Now, in this nerdy framework of ours, gold can be explained using the macro force, the big picture stuff. What's happening to gold right now? It's gone up significantly. And what is the macro evidence of that? Well, we know that government debt relative to the GDP is now higher than almost any point in US history outside of World War II. And global sovereign debt, at the same time, has exploded faster than economic growth itself. Now, also thanks to the changing world order, central banks around the world have been buying physical gold at the fastest pace in modern history. In a lot of countries, gold also now makes up a bigger share of official reserves than it has in years, which means the sovereigns, or tier 1 nations with nuclear weapons, are choosing gold over other assets like US treasuries. So there's a lot of structural gravity